Last summer, it popped into my head, sensory conditions. It's a word I hear all the time, it's a word I use all the time. But when I really got down to it, I didn't really know what it meant. I got this idea in my head, what is a sensory condition? If I'm dealing with sensory conditions effectively, I have to know what it is. What am I working with? So we all know that sensory conditions cause disturbances, delusions, and transgressions. It's anything that moves our mind from our true and noble original nature. But it occurred to me that thinking of it in those terms was like saying a germ is something that makes us sick. It's not very useful in staying healthy or developing a cure. So I wanted to know the nature of sensory conditions like we know the nature of germs and viruses, so we have effective relief. The first thing I wanted to make clear to myself was it's so easy to think of sensory conditions as bad things, things we don't like. The scriptures tell us in chapter 9, House of Spiritual Treasures, 15, the founding master said, in attaining the great way, favorable conditions are no better than adverse conditions. Therefore, whenever favorable conditions occur, a practitioner must guard against them, as if one were facing a venomous serpent. So I think, how many bad things have I done in my life because I wanted things I like? Maybe more than for avoiding things I dislike. So that venomous serpent makes a lot of sense. So the first thing I did was eliminate that preconception that if I hate it, it's a sensory condition. If I like it, it's okay. That was a big step. It broadened my attention. So then I had to get down to, what is it? I had a Dharma friend years ago who used to tell stories over and over again about how her husband would drive her crazy. And she stopped referring to him as her husband and just started saying, my sensory condition. Yeah, I thought that was pretty funny too. But in the back of my head, that doesn't seem right. It's, he's not a sensory condition. So I it's a joke. But then a few months ago, a minister gave a Dharma talk and referred to his wife as a sensory condition. And he wasn't joking. It was a serious part of his Dharma talk. I went, oh. And see, there's another preconception that I have to examine. So, I start from scratch. I want to share just my impressions, my reflections. I don't have answers yet. This is going to be open-ended. And maybe I'll ask you for advice at the end. Sort of work through a specific question I have. But sensory conditions, they start with the 5 skandhas. And we know that from the Heart Sutra. We have sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. And those are broken down in Buddhist psychology in 3 elements. We have that thing out there that we're sensing, that thing we see, that thing we taste, that thing we smell. We have the organs that bring them in, our eyes, our mouth, our nose, our ears, our body. And then we have whatever happens in our mind, that input from that interaction between the first 2 things. So that's the most basic. So a sensory condition is simply something that's external that we have an organ to perceive and creates some kind of input in our brain. But then they add a 6th sense, which took a while for me to get acclimated to, and that is our mind. It's important to think of our mind as a sense organ, just like our eyes and our nose and our ears and our mouth, because your mind creates things. Just creates things. Steve, did you just roll your eyes at me? This is what I'm talking about. Our eyes think we're seeing Steve rolling his eyes at me, and my mind goes, he doesn't respect what I'm saying. He doesn't believe it. He's got a lot of nerve disrupting my Dharma talk like this. So now I've got a beef with Steve here, calls out of thin air. 90% 90% of what I go through in my day is exactly that thing. So a sensory condition arises just from thin air. It doesn't even have to be from external circumstances. It's also internal circumstances. So now I'm more confused than I've ever been. So that's the sensory part. There's also the conditions part. Conditions as in circumstances. But conditions also brings to my mind conditioning. And Barry, I'm going to start talking about something I don't know about, so feel free to fact check me, because this is kind of your backyard.
Well, that'll be a topic for later discussion.
All right, we've had this talk before.
We will again. I'm sure this is an ongoing thing.
So conditioning is the idea that our minds are conditioned by things, by what it experiences. And the classic example is classical conditioning, Barry, and if I'm not mistaken, operant conditioning. I'm good enough so far. So when we think of classical conditioning, the first thing people who know of it talk about Pavlov's dogs. And you may know who Pavlov's dogs are. These poor dogs that were kept in cages and fed. And Pavlov would look at them, and when the food would come, they were so hungry they'd start slobbering. And he'd go, cool, now watch this. And he would then wait for the dogs to get real hungry, ring a bell, ding, and then give them the food, and they would see the food and start slobbering. Over time, when he would ring the bell, bing, the dogs would start slobbering, knowing that food was coming. They were being conditioned to behave in a certain way based on something happening that had nothing to do with whatever it was that they wanted or didn't want. Our minds work the same way. Random things can trigger responses in our mind. When I was a kid, my grandmother lived down in the Ozarks on the lake, and we would visit her every summer. And the last hour and a half to 2 hours of that drive were through the Ozark Mountains like this, roller coaster. And my brother and I would get car sick every time. It wasn't a question of how many times, whether we would barf. It would be how many times we would barf in the last 2 hours of that trip. My grandmother had, strangest thing, all her mulching around her plants around her house, pink quartz. I had no idea why. But we would come out of the car, sick as dogs, see the pink quartz. For years, every time I saw pink quartz, I would get kind of sick to my stomach. So, we are subject to the same things that dogs are subjected to. When I was first thinking about sensory conditions, I don't know why this cropped in my mind. I guess Pavlov's dogs moved me to another dog. But I thought, I'm 3 years old. I get mauled by a dog. I get torn up pretty bad. So when I grow up to be 8 years old, 10 years old, I really hate dogs. So when I'm out and about, if a stray dog comes up, I kick at it. Or I see a dog off in the distance and I grab rocks and I throw rocks at it. I'm generally as abusive as I can be to dogs. So I was thinking, I'm doing something transgressive. Where's the sensory condition? In the moment, when I throw that rock at that dog, where's the sensory condition that I would have to deal with in order to avoid that transgression? Is it the dog when I was 3 years old that bit me? Is it the dog that I'm seeing right now? Is it what I was feeling when that dog bit me when I was 3 years old? Is it what I'm feeling now? Is it all of those things? And that's what I've been pondering all this time. And I've been pestering every minister that I've run across in the last 6 months. I have posed this question to, just trying to get a bunch of different perspectives on what it is. So, this is what I went through. I'm going to go back to the mind. There are 9 consciousnesses in Buddhism. The first 5 consciousnesses are the 5 skandhas. The 6th consciousness is our mind. The 7th consciousness, and I'm maybe going to try and pronounce these words. The 7th consciousness is basically that thing that is us. That thing that we create to help us navigate everyday life. It takes in the inputs from the 6 other senses, other consciousnesses, and categorizes them, sorts them, what's important, what's not important. This is where we come up with the 3 reactions. This happens, it's good. This happens, it's bad. This happens, it's neutral. So that makes 18, if I'm counting right. 18 possibilities. Once that happens, our mind can then attach to it as pleasurable or detach from it as unpleasurable. So that 18 times 2 is 36. Those are the 36 earthly desires. All the combinations of inputs and our seventh sense's reaction to them and what we do with that reaction. That's a lot of gobbledygook. There's not going to be a test, so you don't have to remember that. But it shows what happens. Our mind naturally, in the course of operating in the world properly and well, we have this process. It's not good or bad, it's just the way it works. As that happens over and over again, our eighth consciousness comes into play. And that's the storehouse of all these events and reactions. So if something happens to us over and over and over again, it becomes reinforced and it creates habitual reactions. This happens, I hate that, I do this. This happens, I love that, I do this. If something big happens to us, either pleasurable or unpleasurable, it can also do that same thing. That dog biting me at 3 causes me to have this reaction to every dog I see. It then becomes, that's that situation where we become separated from our true, noble, original nature. The eighth consciousness is that buffer. We lose the fact that we have that ninth consciousness, that Buddha nature, and we get caught up in the seventh consciousness and the eighth consciousness as they come together and create these reactions and store them up and recreate them again. Little tidbit, you don't have to remember this either. Those 36 can happen in the past, the present, and the future. If you do the math, I think that's 108, and that's why we have 108 beads on our malas. That is all the defilements. 108 defilements are all those things coming together. So in the scholarly fall version of this, that's how it's structured. In the everyday, down in the trenches, this is my question. What do I grab hold of in that moment where I pick up that rock? What do I hold on to so I don't throw it? So I put it down, or maybe even reach out and try to pet that dog. There's a Korean word I love. I don't fully understand it, but I like to talk about things I don't understand, so I will continue. The word is gyeonggae.
Which one?
Gyeonggae. Gyeonggae. It depends on what letters you use to spell it. I have no idea how it's spelled. It tends to be used to signify, for me, that arising mind. This is what happened to me. I put up a bird feeder and it got covered with sparrows and starlings. I had a gyeonggae because I don't want them, I want the cardinals and the titmice. I didn't know a bird feeder could create such a gyeonggae. Gyeonggae comes up from all those things. The thing that interests me really about this word, I love it, is that one of the meanings of gyeonggae is a sense of a boundary. So this is how I incorporate it, and this is just me. I don't know if this is true. This is just the way I've built this for myself to work with. When events happen, and my seventh consciousness, my just everyday mind says, ooh, I don't like that, and the eighth mind goes, you know what you need to do this, and do that, and do that. What happens over time is a boundary is created somewhere in there. It's almost like if it's a bad thing, a scab, or if it's a good thing, a little pleasure nodule is created, and then there are these like electric eyes that are set up. So if anything comes close to the electric eye, it's like beep, 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 like that. So that, to me, that is what a sensory condition is. It's not the thing out there. It's not necessarily the thing deep inside me. It's that boundary I've created, that electric eye I've set up, so when I see something and I go, beep, 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 I want, or beep, 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 get away, get away, get away. In the moment, that is what I go to. Which beeper's gone off? How do I turn it off? Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. I have had this gyeonggae since I was in grade school. I have had a deep, deep dread of Monday morning. deep dread. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, but it is always there and has been all this time. And over 50 plus years, I have had a lot of time to try to figure out what is the sensory condition, what's causing this. I have exhausted every possibility, and the reason is I have no way of controlling or fixing anything that contributes to that. It's genetics in people from back then, it's the circumstances. There were political circumstances, there were historical circumstances that made me hate to go to school. Hate it so much that I would pretend to be sick as often as I could to avoid going to school. I created sensory conditions based on Sunday nights, the wonderful world of Disney, the closing music. I would start getting really panicky because that meant the weekend was over. To this day, if I hear that music, I still get a little... So I am Pavlov's dog in the lifelong sense. So, I have over 50 years uncovered and unpacked every possible thing I could unpack, and it didn't do a whole lot of good. So, as I began practicing here and really working with it, I got to the point where I could say, you know, the bottom line is that's just my mind doing what my mind does. And that was very liberating. First, because it relieved me of the pressure of trying to figure out. It disengaged my thinking mind. I could let that go. The other thing it did was a beautiful first lesson in acceptance. If I can say that's just my mind doing what it does, I then don't have that idea of I've got to do something about this, or it's my fault. I've been practicing for 2 years. Why is this still happening? We can build Gyenge on top of Gyenge that way. You feel bad because you shouldn't feel like you should feel that way. Ugh. So if I can stop there for a moment and say, this is just my mind doing what it does. I have some room, I can breathe, and by gosh, it just kind of passes. And I've had great success over the last 3 or 4 years with that. The problem I have, though, is it reinforces a long-standing aversion to digging in to what are the causes. I don't have any interest. I don't want to know. It's just my mind doing what it does. In some sense, it's like having a hammer. It's just my mind doing what it does. Bam. Okay. Oh, it's just my mind doing what it does. Bam. Bam, bam. I don't want to put down my hammer, and I think maybe I need more tools. Because in the moment is one thing, but there's also the mind study aspect, the journaling aspect. I struggled tremendously to journal. I didn't journal at all this week because I just hate doing it. And I'm realizing in putting together the talk this week, it's not that I hate to write. That's what I've always said. I hate to write. I have no interest in digging into what happened this weekend. Why? It's just my mind being my mind. It works. So now I'm worried that I'm missing a big part of my practice because I don't value looking at the sensory condition in terms of what is really that barrier, what is that boundary I've built, how do I get rid of it long term? See, my barrier for barrier. We've been talking about this. I'm going to bring it in. He is, I treasure him because he is invested in this investigation, this mind study, and I go, I'm not interested, I don't want to hear about it. We agree to disagree. But now I'm beginning to realize that, you know, this hill I'm trying to die on may not be worth it, and I need to come down the hill, perhaps. So that is sort of where I am right now. What do you guys think? Does anybody have any advice for me about this, considering where I am and where Barry is?
Yeah.
Start over. Give me your best reason why I should care.
So here's the thing. There's an aversion to looking at what it is you don't want to see, which is part of the template that keeps you stuck.
Yeah? What did you say, Angela? What do you think?
I am stuck there too. I can totally relate with you. I feel like some of the things that you talked about, they're traumas that we've encountered, and you know, trauma changes the chemistry of your brain. And the only way to unchange it is to go through it, and you get to a point where you're like, nope. not
So,
going
so,
there.
Okay,
so,
hold
so,
on.
wait, so wait. So the,
I'm
He
trying
wants to
see
hear
if
from
I-
me because I'm agreeing with him, Barry.
well, it's not that I'm disagreeing with him.
I've been working for a long time on not interrupting.
This is advice. This is advice. I'm not.
I know.
It's like he asked for advice.
I'm kidding.
So it's like, how do you awaken
Yeah,
from this
by doing
dream?
the work.
Because he's saying he has an aversion to like wanting to
Yes.
dig into things. And so if you have an aversion, then automatically
Yes.
there's an emotion there, which is like, I don't want to go there.
Yes.
And it's too
100%.
uncomfortable for me. I don't want to do that. And what's that all about?
I don't want to do
You know,
it
so
for
then
same
it becomes the
reasons.
object for
Yeah.
your
This
study,
is what I would say.
for the arising of
This is what I
something
would
that
say.
is uncomfortable.
I don't feel like I've had a trauma in my life. People might look at what happened to me and say, you have a trauma. I don't believe I've had traumas. Things have happened to me, and I don't mind. I have dug into everything as much as I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And I think I've gotten out of it what I need to get out of it. I may be wrong, and Barry, we will talk afterwards about this. Unless I have something else to do.
Okay, I'll back off.
Go ahead.
I'll stop.
Yeah, I wonder, because you're treating this almost scientifically, like
Mhm.
exactly where you're going, but how about if you just write your journal in terms of finding the way to each one of the conditions that you run into, instead of trying to figure out why. You know, just deal with it, like this is what's happening, this is what I can do about it, and forget about the why. You know, I know a great man who used to say, why just takes you into the pit of because.
Why? What? Say it again.
Just, you fall into the pit of because.
Oh, the pit of because. Thank you.
Yes.
I hope that resonates with me. But I hope I'm just not being prejudicial because it's what I want to hear. But I thank you for that. Go ahead, Georgia.
I think this whole discussion, dilemma, and what you've shared is the only way I have ever figured out is when I am in that static moment of the sensory condition, is go to the present moment, the now, the now, the now, not backward, not forward. I can't figure it out. I can't waste my time figuring it out because I'm missing out on now.
Thank you, Georgia. That brings me to the last point I want to make. I was really, really fortunate. I took the Canon study with the Won Institute this past winter, and there was a question and answer period with the Venerable Juksan Mimi.
Thank you.
I was so happy. I don't know why I had the nerve to do this, but I did. When we had a question and answer period with him, I told him about my dog biting the 30-year-old story. And I asked him that question, where's the sensory condition? And he said, in response to sensory conditions, ask yourself, is this a time to practice? Or is this a time to create blessings? I'm going to leave you with that, okay?